All right. Well, welcome everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tyler Jost. I'm an assistant professor here in the Political Science Department at Watson Institute. It's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Professor Martin Dimitrov to talk about his new book titled Dictatorship and Information, which is just recently published in is December or January?
Officially January, but actually December. So
Okay.
yes, end of December, early January.
Very recent, hot off the presses. You can still feel it. We're really excited to have him here. We're going to run this session just a tad different than we have previous sessions, for those of you who have joined us in the past. So Martin's going to give a brief overview about the book. But then we're going to do kind of a Q&A with me and him for maybe 20 minutes or so, because I had the good fortune to read through the book over the past couple of days, and it's really wonderful. We'll talk about that in a second. But we'll do that as a Q&A, and then we'll open it up for the remainder of the session to the audience. So hold your questions until that third section of it. I should give a little bit of a background for the guest that distinguishes Dr. Dimitrov. So he is a professor of political science at Tulane University. I count this as his fourth solo author book. The previous ones being Privacy in the State, which is out of Cambridge University Press in 2009. Why Communism Did Not Collapse, also Cambridge 2013, and The Politics of Socialist Consumption out in 2018. He received his PhD from Stanford University in 2004 and held residential fellowships at the University of Helsinki, Harvard University, Princeton University, Notre Dame, as well as the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And I would just note, among his many awards and honors, in 2012, he received the Berlin Prize and Axel Springer Fellowship from the American Academy in Berlin. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Dimitrov.
Thank you, Professor Jost, for this wonderful introduction. And I want to thank Professor Jost for the very kind invitation. I also want to thank Professor Singh for helping with that invitation, and Christy Kilgus, who has been amazingly wonderful in arranging this visit to the Watson Institute. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I will just very briefly review some of the arguments in my book, and then we'll turn to the conversation with Professor Jost and then to the Q&A from the rest of the room. So this book, Dictatorship and Information, Authoritarian Regime Resilience in Communist Europe and China, is primarily concerned with a methodological problem. And the methodological problem is, how can we study non-transparent phenomena in autocracies? Now, of course, there is a wide class of such phenomena. So I thought it might be useful for us to think of a specific example. And that specific example is how autocrats assess their level of popular support. And when thinking about these specific questions, we can have two different sets of answers. One set of answers is produced by scholars who are studying this issue, and another set of answers is produced by autocrats who are also quite interested in this particular question. And the puzzle for us is, to what extent scholars and autocrats have the same solution to this actual problem in autocracies, namely the level of popular support for the regime. So what I will do is I will review some of the scholarly answers, and then I will argue that autocrats actually have a different answer from the dominant answer in the existing scholarly literature. So to start off, we have a large body of research on the dictator's dilemma, on the impossibility of dictators to assess their level of support. And what this literature does is it reaches pessimistic conclusions about autocracies. It argues that because of the ubiquity of preference falsification, where citizens publicly declare their support for the regime, even though they're privately opposed to it, dictators feel insecure, they increase repression, but then repression only makes their regimes more brittle. Therefore, the empirical expectation of that literature is that dictatorships will be short-lived and there will be coups and revolutions. And as we see from this table, some dictatorships are indeed short-lived, but there is a subtype of non-democratic regime, namely the single-party communist regime, that displays surprising longevity. And in fact, single-party communist regimes are the longest-lived dictatorial regime. This suggests that they may have found ways to alleviate or perhaps even potentially solve the dictator's dilemma, this problem of assessing the level of support that dictators have. And so we have a second scholarly answer to this question of how dictators assess the level of support. And this second answer focuses on easily observable indicators. And it argues that dictators can mitigate the information problem by promoting elections, by encouraging protests, or by studying the content of commercial media. And what I argue in my book is that, of course, these three channels reveal information about levels of popular discontent, but they reveal it to two audiences. They reveal it to autocrats, and they also reveal it to other citizens who can use that information to engage in collective action. Therefore, from the point of view of autocrats, information that is publicly available is not useful. What autocrats want is to foster channels that allow for the private, privileged, private, vertical transmission of information. So there we go to the third solution to the problem of the dictator's dilemma and the question of how much support autocrats actually have. And I argue that this third solution is to study direct sources and to see what they reveal to autocrats about levels of support. So these direct sources are classified materials. They're generated for insiders. They circulate only vertically rather than both vertically and horizontally. They're prepared mainly by the Communist Party, by state security, and by the state media. They're classified and difficult to obtain, but if we can obtain them, the payoff is that they reveal what autocrats knew. And my book is based primarily on this type of sources. And so what I will do in the next 10 minutes or so is I will specify how I understand information. There are many definitions of this concept. I will present the argument in brief. I will highlight the method that I use in the book, which I call archival ethnography, and I will very briefly review some of the empirical and theoretical contributions of that method. I will touch upon scope conditions. The party matters. That's the preview of scope conditions. And then I will conclude with some reflections on theory generation and the study of autocracies. Now, when we think about information, the way that I understand it is information is actionable intelligence. There are certain types of information that I don't focus on in this book. So I don't discuss basic demographic indicators or socioeconomic indicators. There is an extensive and very strong literature on that. What I'm interested in is political information, which I use interchangeably with socio-political intelligence. This comes from the sources. The two terms are used synonymously. And when it comes to political information, there are three subtypes. There's foreign intelligence. There's information that focuses on monitoring the mood of elites. And then there's information that derives from monitoring the mood of the masses. And I argue in this book that this third subtype of socio-political intelligence, monitoring the mood of the masses, is, from a technical point of view, the most difficult to collect. And therefore, for me, it's the most interesting. So most of my book is about monitoring the mood of the masses, although I do pay some attention to monitoring the mood of elites. I don't really pay attention to foreign intelligence, but others, including in this room, have done that extremely well. So the book is organized in 5 parts. Each part consists of 2 chapters. Of course, I start with theory and method. What is the dictator's dilemma? What are the solutions to this dilemma? And how internally generated materials help us understand how autocrats themselves conceptualize this problem. Then I have paired comparisons of China and Bulgaria. Those are the 2 main communist regimes that I study in this book. I start off with 2 chapters that look at the parallel origins of the communist information states. This Typically, these two countries are not considered to have anything in common. I find a lot of parallels, but then I find that they diverge from the late 1950s onwards in terms of the evolution of the information states. They diverge in order to meet again, because in 1989, both in China and in Eastern Europe, there are crises, and I argue that these crises are quite similar, but they occur in different contexts, and of course, there are different responses to them, with then implications for the subsequent regime trajectories. And then I conclude with a part on the generalizability of the theory, talking about scope conditions and authoritarian regime resilience. So this is the structure of the book. Now, in terms of the argument, in brief, in 2 slides, what I argue in this book is that all communist regimes rely on the triumvirate of the party, state security, and internal media to monitor the public mood. There is a temporal variation in the strategies that they employ to monitor the public mood. Initially, the focus is on the involuntary extraction of information, which enables what I call ex post or retrospective rule that prioritizes repression. Over time and under specific conditions of low repression and high responsiveness, the voluntary provision of information through complaints is possible, and this enables ex ante or anticipatory rule. There are 2 models in my book. The first one is the classic socialist social contract. This existed in Bulgaria, but also in a range of other East European communist regimes. There, what we had was low repression, high welfare entitlements, and high voluntary provision of information through complaints. The other model is the market social contract in China from the 78 to the present, where I argue there is medium repression, medium welfare entitlements, and moderate voluntary provision of information through complaints. Despite the differences between these 2 models, under both models, long-term resilience, I argue, rests on repression, redistribution, and the promotion of indigenous cultural consumption. The less repressive and more redistributive socialist social contract leads to a higher quality of governance, but is more costly and can malfunction, forcing the regime to renege and the masses to then withdraw their conditional loyalty. When coupled with minority unrest and divisions, this leads to democratization, as it did in Bulgaria in 89-91. Counterintuitively, the more repressive and less redistributive model in China, the market social contract, is quite durable, but protests and minority unrest may yet destabilize it. So in sum, the dictator's dilemma can be solved, with the exception of ethnic minorities, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But solving the dilemma cannot ensure the durability of the regime in perpetuity. So those are my main claims. And how do I arrive at these claims? How do I study information gathering in communist regimes? The 2 types of sources that I use, but I use judiciously, are memoirs and interviews, because of strategic forgetfulness, opportunistic invention of facts in the memoir literature, and the fact that when it comes to interviews, there are very few experts that can comment on the totality of the information gathering universe. So obviously, I privilege archives and internal sources that are meant for regime insiders. And I study those through the method of archival ethnography. So in terms of what archival ethnography is, much like standard ethnographic approaches, it involves immersion, but in this case, immersion in regime-generated materials, and it requires time. So what matters in ethnography is cumulative time, with the hope that through this cumulative experience, we gain understanding of something that we didn't understand prior to the immersion. Now, certain aspects of archival ethnography are different from the standard ethnographic approaches. Archival ethnography is replicable. What I do in my book is I provide full archival identifiers to the files that I use to substantiate various types of arguments. Archival ethnography yields very rich data. And this data is amenable to both qualitative process tracing, something that we standardly associate with ethnography, but I argue that it's also amenable to various types of quantitative analysis, and I do that in the book. Archival ethnography can be combined with ethnographic techniques like in-depth interviews. And so these are the main features of archival ethnography. Why archival ethnography matters to me is that there is a big payoff that ensues from doing it. And the payoff is that archival ethnography allows us to open up the black box of information gathering, transfer, and use. And it allows us to see what the dictator wanted to see. And this is thrilling, or it has been for me, when I read some of these documents. Okay, now in terms of what I did, this book took a while to write. And I've given this talk to graduate students in a couple of places, and they have said, now, for somebody who doesn't have 15 years, what do you recommend? So we can get into that during the Q&A. But it did take me 15 years from start to finish. So it was multi-site archival ethnography. I conducted 36 months of fieldwork in China, Bulgaria, Germany, Taiwan, Russia, Cuba, Argentina, and in the US. I did research in 30 in and out of country archival repositories, special collections, naval collections that were containing confidential, secret, and top secret materials. And I also worked with some leaked data sets. So the collection of documents involved several different cases: China, Bulgaria, the German Democratic Republic, Cuba, the Soviet Union, Taiwan, and Argentina. Now, in terms of what I consulted, I did not like the first two types of documents, personal files. So here I have two famous examples, one from a Bulgarian French intellectual who turns out to have been a state security informant for Bulgarian state security. The other one is from the first democratic president of Poland, who was a state security informant during communism. Both cases are highly controversial. The authenticity of the files is disputed, and it doesn't concern me because these are highly atypical cases. What I'm interested in is the document in the bottom slide of the file. This is a KGB annual report from 1967, and it contains information that was so sensitive that it had to be added by hand. So the typist couldn't learn that information. The head of the KGB put it in by hand. And this information is about the number of KGB agents that were recruited in that particular year. And so this type of information allows us to estimate the density of agents and the frequency of the phenomenon of recruiting informants in the Soviet Union. And those types of summary reports are of particular interest to me, and I use them frequently in this book. Now, the value of archives, I argue, is that they reveal the epistemic anxieties of information collectors, what they wanted to know, thus documenting the existence of the dictator's dilemma. Dictators actually did want to know what level of support they had in society. Archives reveal the categories of regime opponents, so who was tracked in communist regimes. They also reveal the techniques that were used to collect information. These techniques range from the monitoring of dreams, rumors, and jokes to the more typical reading people's mail and their electronic communication surveillance, and so on and so forth. They reveal the indicia of different types of discontent. They reveal how information is transferred and used. So cumulatively, what they do is they reveal how the dictator's dilemma is solved. Now, I will move into highlighting some of the insights at the micro and macro level from the archives. So in the, and I'll just focus on China for brevity, and given that it's mostly a China audience. So at the micro-empirical level, one insight is about the desirability of protests. In the China literature, there's an argument that the Chinese government encourages protests because it has no other sources of information. And what I argue in the book is that archival materials point to the exact opposite conclusion. Protests are a direct threat to stability maintenance, and stability maintenance has been a top concern at least since 1989. And analysis of 65,000 cases of protests that I conducted with one of my PhD students, now Professor Zhu Zhang, indicates that instead of being encouraged, protests are suppressed in China. And this goes against much of the literature on protests. And what I argue in the book is that what the government wants is petitions, letters and visits, rather than mass incidents or protests. But the problem is there are fewer and fewer petitions and there are more and more protests. I'm going to move through these very quickly. So I'm going to go to another micro-empirical implication, and that concerns the question of whether China still needs human informants, given that it has this extremely high density of cameras and very sophisticated infrastructure for surveillance. And this is your friendly grid supervisor from a neighborhood in Guangzhou, a photograph I took some years ago. And what this photograph reveals is that, indeed, this man needs to hear from the people for whom he is responsible to supervise, and the various ways that they can contact him with various concerns that they have. And in fact, our data indicate that China has a very high density of police informants. And when we compare it against other communist regimes, such as the stylized case of East Germany, where everybody thinks that East Germany had the highest density of informants, China has more, and this is an underestimate in the Chinese case. So visible informants have not been made redundant by artificial intelligence. They're in fact essential to interpreting the information that is collected through the cameras and through other mechanisms. Now, on the macro level, I'm just going to talk about a couple of implications. There are more, but we don't have time. So what I argue in my book is that communist regimes aim to have this totalistic vision of society, and they try to have perfect legibility. And to a certain extent, they may succeed with one major exception, and that major exception is compactly settled ethnic minorities. There, the legibility is highly imperfect, which means that there will be surprise eruptions of discontent in places like Tibet and Xinjiang. And the way that I interpret the most recent, well, now 6 years old, measures implemented in Xinjiang, the mass internment of Uyghurs, is as evidence of the incapacity to penetrate this minority. So the ethnic assimilation policies, for me, are not evidence of strength, they're evidence of weakness, because if the regime was strong, it would have penetrated the minorities in different ways, and it wouldn't have to resort to these internment facilities. A final macro insight, and then I'll move to general reflections and a conclusion so we can proceed with our conversation. There is this widespread trope about East European leaders who are portrayed as hapless, uninformed individuals who just happened to be there, and the events of '89 took place, and they were taken by complete surprise. So my interpretation, which is backed with data that I don't have time to show, but they are in chapter 9, and then other chapters have data on other East European regimes, is that Erich Honecker, much like other East European leaders, was unable to act. He was informed, but he couldn't act on the information he had. He saw it coming, he couldn't act. So that is on the macro level. In terms of some general insights from archival ethnography, the general insights are that the dictator's dilemma can be solved with the exception of this blind spot of ethnic minorities. However, and solving the dilemma results in high quality of governance, with private petitioning being the wellspring of stability that indexes trust in the regime. However, solving the dilemma does not ensure the permanence of either the dictator or the regime. Democratization in '89 did not ensue from a lack of information. Incumbents had knowledge of the coup plotting, but could not act. So these are some of the bigger claims in the book. And in terms of scope conditions, in chapter 9, which is this insanely long chapter, I examine, and the book overall is longish, chapter 9 being the longest chapter in the book. So this is the scope conditions chapter because I go through the entire range of non-democratic regimes, examining further communist regimes like East Germany, the Soviet Union, and Cuba, but also looking at Leninist non-communists like Taiwan during martial law, looking at other types of regimes. And what I find is that what truly matters is having a communist party. So the Communist Party is not only the entity that coordinates all information gathering, it's also an independent information gatherer. So it gathers its own information, it instructs other entities how to gather. So the presence of the party creates a much richer information gathering infrastructure. And what differs is whether these regimes have a communist party or not. If they don't have a communist party, then their information gathering infrastructures become increasingly impoverished as we're moving down this list. So this is my best attempt at summarizing the 90-page chapter, but it is in the book. Now, in terms of what we have learned, what I've argued in the book is that scholars have different options when generating theories of information and when approaching this question of how the dictator's dilemma might be solved. They can work with stylized facts that allow them to generate certain theories. They can also focus on readily observable empirical indicators of, for example, elections, protests, and the content of publicly available media, or they have a third option, which is to focus on classified internal materials, which I call direct sources. It's important to stress that these direct sources, when they were generated, the document generation process was not driven by the expectation that these documents will ever be seen by non-insiders. So they're generated for regime insiders and they circulate as such, and we can now consult them. Regime insiders privilege channels that allow for information to be transmitted only vertically rather than both horizontally and vertically, as is done by protests, elections, and the publicly accessible media. And the last point I want to make is that archival ethnography reveals what dictators wanted to know, how they found out, and what they did once they had the information. And so this method of archival ethnography allows us to document both the existence of the dictator's dilemma and its solutions. So thank you for putting up with this condensed version of the book. And now we get to unpack it with Tyler.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for writing such a wonderful book. It's really rich material to dive into. The first question I have, I guess, is queuing off of your comment about your discussion with graduate students and the 15-year process. How long had you been thinking about writing a book on this topic, and at what point did you feel sort of confident that you would have enough empirical material to be able to answer the question you wanted to answer?
For too long, but let me give you some specific examples. So the book began with a footnote in Timur Kuran's essay on the element of surprise in the revolutions of '89. And there was this one footnote that said that in Czechoslovakia, there was some knowledge that perhaps there was a secret Communist Party opinion research institute. And I thought, interesting. What about in other places? So then I discovered that in Bulgaria, there was an institute called the Information Sociological Center of the Central Committee of the Bulgarian Communist Party, but its materials were considered to have been lost. They were found in some closet at the Central State Archives, but they had not been processed. And I thought, damn, I have to wait. And then at some point, it turned out they were processed. And then I thought, let's see. Of course, they knew nothing. And then as I was reading page through page, I just couldn't believe my eyes. And I thought, my goodness, it's like, okay, so like discontent, and this was transferred all the way to the top, and the top wanted to know it. So for me, these materials changed my sense of what communist regime leaders knew. And it also made it clear to me what they wanted to know. So I had those Bulgarian materials from the Central State Archives. Then the State Security Archives also opened up. So there was this other set of materials. And by 2010, I had 7 chapters of what I thought was going to be this book. I had a book conference review, and very little of those 7 chapters survived because, of course, 6 of the 7 were in Eastern Europe. There was one chapter on China, which was about complaints. And then the other systems for information were not there. So then it took a lot of time to discover the equivalent Chinese materials, where they might be located, to then collect them, and then to read through them and figure out how I might use them.
Right.
So had it not been for COVID, this book probably would not have, when everything shut down and research, fieldwork became impossible, then I felt that I have what I have. So it's time to finish this. And there we have the 500-page book. It's out.
It is a sort of interesting method on the Chinese side, in the sense that a lot of the materials that you're using, I think, are available here in the United States. Is that
correct? Yeah. They're available in the United States. They're also available in a few other places. These are Chinese materials that have found their way out of the People's Republic into the special administrative, that is part of the People's Republic. But anyway, they are available in a few different repositories. So a lot of the Chinese materials are in fact available in the US. Some come from Chinese archives that are located in China, and then others come from other places.
So in terms of the book itself, I sort of want to start at the very end. So chapter 9. Which is where you sort of leave off in your talk, because as I was reading through, the thing that kept coming back to me over and over again was why are single party communist
regimes so much better at this than others? Because presumably every dictator wants to solve this dilemma in a way that's going to allow them to politically survive. And it seems that there really is something about regimes in which there's a communist party, as you say, that allows them to solve some underlying organizational problem better than others. Can you just talk a little bit more about like what is it that gives those parties the advantage?
Yeah, I got the answer in the process of writing another book. So I have this short element on the adaptability of the Chinese Communist Party, which I finished after this was completed. And what that focused on is party size. So I don't talk about the size of the party. And then people have said, well, why does it matter? And I think the answer to your question is what a communist party can do over time is it can grow deeper and it can penetrate deeper down in society. It can also ensure horizontal spread. So what communist parties have in contrast to non-communist single-party systems is the organizational infrastructure that allows for this depth of societal penetration as well as for breadth in terms of sectoral breadth. So they're amazing information collection machines. I mean, of course, they have other functions like indoctrination, but it is the particular structure of the Communist Party that is not replicated by non-communist parties that allows for this penetration that then is essential for information collection.
As you've been thinking through like this aspect of party regimes, do you see, is there a downside to having these types of information collection capacities? In what I'm thinking of is sort of Svolik's way of describing coercive organizations, which are responsible for the sort of execution of repression, whereas your framework is about the anticipation of the need for repression. But is there ever an instance in which delegating this much authority to collect information within the states sort of creates the hand that ultimately is able to unseat you?
Yeah, I mean, so what I argue in the book is that what we have is redundancy of information collection by design. So state security absolutely is engaged in collecting information about popular dissent, but it is collecting all sorts of other information. It doesn't just collect information about popular dissent. The Communist Party also collects information about popular dissent, as does internal journalism, the third arm of information collection. So I don't find that we have delegation of information collection to any single entity in a communist regime. In fact, we have this amazing ecosystem of multiple institutions and multiple channels with overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities. And oftentimes what comes to the top is information that is largely similar, but it's received through different channels. And this helps alleviate another problem, which is the agency problem. I mean, we know that, who wants to hear about unpleasant news? But the unpleasant news needs to be communicated at some point, and creating these multiple information collectors allows for that to happen.
One other thing that struck me about this is by the numbers, mass uprisings, revolutions are typically not the way in which dictators are unseated. It tends to be through elite coups. So it was striking to me that, because most of the time when I think about intelligence collection inside of these regimes, I'm thinking about monitoring other elites who would depose. It is striking that there's so much emphasis placed upon public opinion given those numbers. But then it got me thinking, well, is actually that an artifact that some regimes are actually quite good at monitoring the masses?
Yeah, I mean, so this is a very interesting question, Tyler, because much of the literature on autocracies focuses on elites, understandably so, but oftentimes, at least I feel, the masses are ignored. And from my point of view, of course, elites matter. I mean, they absolutely matter at the beginning of the regime. They also matter at the end when the regimes end. And you're correct, they end through palace coups rather than through the regular coups or through, well, I mean, sometimes the palace coup is, of course, combined with popular protests. But elites matter. But the reason why they're not this insurmountable monitoring target that the literature might make us feel that they are is that they're numerically small.
Mhm.
So monitoring the elites from a technological point of view is not all that complicated, but the masses, it's everybody else. And those masses are huge. So how do you monitor the masses? And how do you figure what they might want?
Mhm.
And then how do you give them what they might want in the sphere of consumption in order to prevent the eruption of political discontent? Now, that is a problem for communist regimes.
So speaking of elites, or I guess in this case, it might be street level bureaucrats, Fred Logewell had this question in a Q&A with Chen Jian at one, it was just wonderful, in which Chen Jian, as you know, is working on that biography of Zhou Enlai. And he asked about whether in the process of doing his work, I'm not sure if you would call it archival ethnography, but in the process of going through the documents, if there were individuals that you as the author had sort of developed a sort of unusual either sympathy towards or kind of antipathy towards. Perhaps this is like going beyond what you're comfortable saying as a neutral and objective social scientist, but I'm curious for the historian in you if perhaps that came through.
Well, fortunately, I don't have sympathy or antipathy for anybody. But I think I have more understanding of what these leaders wanted to know. So they were more curious than we oftentimes assume they are. So is this a redeeming quality? I don't know, but it's probably a necessary quality in order to survive in power for as long as they did. And then there are all these hagiographies of the Bulgarian leader in particular, of which I read many of those memoirs, and they say, he read the state security reports from dawn to dusk. I think, well, but actually there are not that many. I mean, I've actually looked at the reports, so it doesn't require from dawn to dusk. But then, the Chinese version, I mean, we all know and love Ezra Vogel, who passed away a couple of years ago. So in his acclaimed biography of Deng Xiaoping, he does say that Deng began his day by reading reports, and he read reports until noon. Then he did other things. So leaders read, they have to. Unless, I mean, in some cases we have illiterate, but that's the, well, no, there are those regimes. I mean, how do you govern when you have somebody who cannot read? But yeah, so, I think, what emerged from the archives is that the leaders of communist regimes were better informed than we might believe from the literature, and they were more curious. Now, how they absorb the information, what they do with it, I mean, the pathologies of information absorption and use are not unique to authoritarian regimes. We have examples from this country about presidents who don't get their daily brief, who eat reports, and do whatever else they might want to do. Well, I don't know. It says he ate. I don't know whether he did. Anyway, right. So he didn't take his president's daily briefing, though. I mean, we do know that.
That part I was aware of.
Right, right.
You have that wonderful quote from Chen Yi talking about Nebu Cancao as I think he called it the daily bread or something to that effect. Right. And one of the things that is always, so for the audience, this is an internal circular that's produced by Xinhua News Agency that is only consumed for party. Am I accurate description? Okay. One of the most fascinating things about Nebu Cancao in my mind is the fact that it's able to survive the Cultural Revolution, and one of their very few that really is able to survive untouched, because everything from foreign intelligence to domestic intelligence is affected in various to various levels by the political turmoil. Did you ever have a sense of how was it possible for that particular agency and that one report to survive in what it seems like, and I haven't seen those reports from that era, but the most tumultuous political period in modern Chinese political history?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what the Xinhua News Agency had was the support of both Mao and Zhou Enlai. So they both valued the reporting of the Xinhua News Agency, especially in a time when other reporting streams were drying up. So they were aware of the importance of redundancy, or at least some kind of alternative source of information. So we have evidence of leadership advocacy for the Xinhua News Agency. That's a partial answer. I don't have a better answer as to how exactly they survived, except that the information that they produced was valued by the top leaders.
That's interesting. Speaking of the top leaders, though, you have this other paragraph in one of your China chapters where you're talking about, and I did not know this at all, a lot of the statistical methods for evaluating popular discontent in the Mao era came from Mao himself. And they were sort of, that was, if I understand the argument correctly, seen as the right and proper way to do things. And then there were others who were like, well, maybe there are these things called statistics in which we would think about sampling and external validity, so on and so forth. So I guess two questions. Could you say perhaps a bit more about that? And at what point did these organizations begin to adopt perhaps the rightist view of looking at statistics?
Well, that's a great question. So Mao, as this room knows, advocated the typical survey, where you find one place and then you assume that it's representative of other places. And we know that this is not how things work. So after the Great Leap Forward, there was a period of statistical introspection. And then the question was, how should we do statistics? And, Arnab Ghosh has a fantastic book on Chinese statistics and various debates there. What emerged for me from the archives was what Neibu Cankao says about these statistical debates, and various ways of doing it, thinking even about random sampling. This, of course, was not a feasible option during the 1960s. Random sampling emerges as a method for conducting survey work in the 1980s, and Melanie Mannion is probably the first American political scientist who conducted her own survey in China in the 1980s. But yeah, the debates about statistics, I feel, become especially pronounced after the disastrous effects of the Great Leap Forward, and the sense that information collection is at best patchy.
One of your figures, I don't believe you showed it in the presentation, if I was reading it correctly, you show that the number of reports inside of Neibu Cankao is negatively correlated with the Great Leap Forward. In other words, as the famine is beginning to take hold and eventually running rampant, folks within the system are less likely to report on it, which was striking to me. And it made me think back to the question you have about redundancy, because I was curious how you thought about that. Is this really just an instance in which redundancy can't solve this problem because the political pressures to report across every silo of the government are so strong? Or how did you think about that?
Yeah, and this is a great question. So what happens during the Great Leap Forward is that the circulation of Neibu Cankao expands to a lower rung of the Chinese leadership, and its informational value precipitously declines. This happens in 1960. And this, of course, is at the height of the Great Leap Forward. So, at that point in time, the number of reports about famine basically disappear. There are other publications that I have not consulted, but I know exist, that had more restricted readership, and we don't know what they reported on. And it's just accessing these publications is extremely difficult. But in terms of the redundancy, we should keep in mind that the sinews of the information state was still being created at that point in time. So this was not a fully developed information state. So it didn't quite have all of these redundant mechanisms that we might associate with a communist information state at a later point in its development. But yes, as the circulation of this classified periodical expands, its information value goes down.
So interesting.
Which is why I tend to love reports that have a single recipient, but those are difficult to access, especially in the Chinese context, not so much in the East European context.
So my last question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. I also feel like your answers have somehow managed to follow the general train of the questions that I had prepared in advance. I'm not sure how that's feasible. But so you note that in the 50s and 60s, the organizational capacity of the intelligence wing of the party is still in nascent form, still firmly part of it, but still expanding. One of the puzzles that emerged to me for me in your chapter on the 80s, or that covered the 80s, was the decision, and this has always puzzled me actually, the decision in 1983 that the MSS needs to start anew, that the Dictatorship or the CID can no longer be, it's no longer viable. It doesn't do what we need our intelligence apparatus to do. Do you have a sense, and I know you talk about Zhao Ziyang's speech on domestic insecurity and the potential for cultural subversion and things like that. So am I understanding you correctly that the need was just, we need an organization that's capable of responding to an elevated level of threat, and what existed in the past won't do, or is there something more there?
Yeah, so this is a fantastic question, because I actually am not fully wedded to the argument that it matters all that much what organizational superstructure directs the collection of intelligence, and it probably matters, but I don't know whether it does. So in most communist regimes, state security is just a department of the Ministry of the Interior. There are some exceptions: East Germany, China, North Korea, and the Soviet Union. Those are only 4 of the 15 communist regimes that had separate ministries of state security. Everywhere else, state security was just a department of the Ministry of the Interior. And it didn't function poorly just because it was a department. So, of course, making it a ministry elevates its stature. It gives it more personnel. It gives it, in theory, more free room to maneuver. But this only happens in 83. So for the first 3 decades of the existence, sorry, 3.5 decades of the existence of the communist regime in China, intelligence collection is managed through other mechanisms. So in terms of why in 83, I do think that this sense of the threat of foreign ideas. So this is a commonality across communist regimes where they're concerned about external ideological influences, democracy, and all of these good things that we cherish, and they want to stop the impact of these ideas. And if the ideas reach the domestic population, they want to blunt their impact by diluting them. And having a separate ministry of state security allows for this to be done more easily. What we observe, though, in the countries that don't have a separate ministry, but it's just a department of the Ministry of the Interior, is that when they're dealing with the ideological threat, they upgrade this department to an even more relevant department. So it's a general directorate rather than just a department, and they create special structures within it specifically to counteract ideological subversion in Eastern Europe. The Chinese equivalent is to safeguard cultural security. So the secret police in the East European context is oftentimes synonymously used with the ideological police. And I think what the creation of the Ministry of State Security in China allows us to see is that in the Chinese context, cultural security, the danger that is presented by these external foreign ideas, is something that the government took very seriously in the 1980s as China is opening up economically to the West, and there's foreign investment, and with the foreign investment, there are more foreign ideas.
It is a very interesting parallel. Right at the exact same time that China's opening up to the world, they sort of begin to immediately see the potential.
Well, there's a 5-year lag, but of course, I mean, the opening is gradual, and we tend to date it to 78, but in fact, it's probably 79 with the foreign investment law, and then other things that happen after that. But there's certainly this concern about what else might be coming to China apart from foreign capital. Foreign ideas are quite dangerous.
Great.
Well, I'll open it up to the rest of the room now. The only thing I did want to just flag, so we are recording this session and it will be posted available on the Watson website, just for your situational awareness. Lyle.
Yeah, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you.
For your achievement. Very impressive. I'll be getting a book on my way out. Two questions. One, that you put up that interesting graphic where you suggested that China has more influence than any other dictatorships, including other communist dictatorships. Can you discuss that more? How you arrived at that conclusion, and what is the temporal aspect of that? I mean, are you saying that's true today, or
Yes.
was that true in 1989 or in 1959? I just wanted to ask more about that assessment, which seems to be like, wow, that is one of the wow moments. The other question is, and this could be outside the scope of the book, I'm not sure, but it strikes me as this is related to that sort of temporal aspect that we know these regimes are learning over time, and as you pointed out, that the communist information system seems to improve or become more elaborate. So did you investigate, or do you know of any investigations into how China perceived what happened in Eastern Europe, and did they learn from that and put those lessons into practice?
Yes, thank you for both questions. Let me start with the second one. This is not in this book, but I do have an essay on how China learned from the Soviet collapse. And there is a project underway that I'm involved with, which is translating some very recent Chinese scholarship on the lessons of the Soviet collapse. And we might think that by now China would have learned what those lessons are. So what is remarkable about this issue is that to this day, the General Secretary and various other Communist Party leaders keep reiterating the importance of learning from the Soviet collapse. And the lessons are dynamic. In the 1990s, the rapid economic reform in the Soviet Union, the Harvard Plan, that was a dirty word. So this was a mistake that the Soviet Union, then post-Soviet Russia had done. And then China did very similar things later on. So the lessons are dynamic. The current lesson is that the Soviet Union collapsed because it engaged in de-Stalinization, and by engaging in de-Stalinization, it undermined the ideological foundations of the Soviet regime. And we might wonder, well, what is the relevance in China? Well, the way that this is relevant for China is that criticizing Mao, the equivalent of Stalin, would undermine the foundations of the Chinese regime. So Mao cannot be criticized. So these days, the lessons are framed as historical nihilism and the danger of historical nihilism. So China is absolutely learning from other communist regimes. But this,
where was that article published?
that was published in 2018
What term?
in a volume. I can send you the article. It's a volume on the Global 89, and there I was looking at China learning, but various other scholars have looked at that. And this is not a question that has lost relevance in China. So there are thousands of articles in Chinese on this issue. They're documentaries, classified, but then eventually they circulate on the lessons. And there was one which was 8 hours long, and now the newest one is an hour and a half, and it's strictly focused on historical nihilism. On your first question on the informants, I go through a lot of discussions in the book on who is an informant. There are various individuals that I believe should not be counted as informants. I only count some types of informants as informants. Therefore, whatever numbers I give, they're underestimates. So China actually has more than this, because what I'm showing is just the visible informants. They wear armbands. And then there are others who are invisible. And those, of course, are highly interesting. And I have some ideas on how many they are, but I don't include them in these graphs. So in East Germany, the standard interpretation is that East Germany had about 1% of its population who functioned as informants. What we have in China in 2017, the most recent year for which I have numbers, is 3% visible. So this is not a historical artifact. And then in various chapters in the book, I go over time, how this changes. So it changes in highly interesting and complex ways. So I think I'll leave it at that. But yes, China has more than East Germany. The paradigmatic case of deep penetration of society with informants.
Don.
Thanks so much for the talk. It was super interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question that I feel like you can say a lot these days, which is what are the implications of your research for Putin's Russia? So on one hand, I can tell a story about how Russia is a communist country, and therefore, state security apparatus is not nearly as good at collecting information. On the other hand, I guess I can tell a story again about how there once was quite an extensive state security apparatus. Putin was actually part of that apparatus, so we may have tried to construct something like it. So I was just wondering if you might speak a bit about that. What are your impressions?
Thank you for the question. So fortunately, Chapter 9, Scope Conditions, does have a discussion of Russia, so I will not have to make this up extemporaneously. I'm very bad at that. So what I argue in the Russian case is that there are some remarkable continuities between contemporary Russia and the Soviet Union. So these continuities focus on the voluntary transmission of information through citizen complaints. So when we think about citizen complaints, we may think of denunciations. You're just denouncing a neighbor because he listens to foreign music or he consorts with foreigners or something like that. But no, I mean, the complaints that I'm interested in are requests for services. I want a bigger pension because I deserve it. I have, my employer is a crook who didn't pay me. I need a bigger apartment. And sometimes they request for better municipal services, these types of things. So I have been obsessed with complaints for quite a while. I mean, they're super interesting. And what is interesting about contemporary Russia is that complaints persist. And in fact, Russia today, on a per capita basis, has more complaints than it had during the Soviet period. So this is a channel that has survived. And instead of complaining to the party, citizens complain to the president's administration. So if one goes to president.ru, you can get these reports. I mean, they published them for about 15 years back on what people complain about, how it's distributed regionally, and so on and so forth. And of course, they can complain by writing a letter. They can complain, electronically. So this persists. What does not persist is the party. I mean, yes, there is United Russia. I mean, there are party structures, but it doesn't have the same depth and breadth of penetration. So my assessment in the short section on Russia under Putin is that the party doesn't have the information collection functions that it had before. Another thing that has changed is that I'm very skeptical about the value of opinion polling in autocracies. But of course, opinion polling in Russia today is more reliable than it was during the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union did opinion polling, but with many problems in how it was executed. So opinion polling is providing accurate and, better information than during the Soviet period. And of course, the intelligence services persist, and they are one of the main anchors of the regime. So in fact, the one thing that has changed is the role of the party. Everything else is still in Russia. And Putin receives a lot of information. Of course, with the war, how this information has changed, how willing he is to hear things right now at this precise moment. I mean, those are important questions, which I think remain as open questions.
Saul.
So I was curious about a couple of cases, recent cases where it seems that the Chinese regime hasn't had the type of that would give them clear insight into what's going on. The first being in Hong Kong, where in particular during the local elections, they expected to go and then more recently in December, protests, COVID restrictions here. So is that a suggestion that the misinformation about some limits in this case, or just cases in all of these countries? Important things
Thank you for the question. And it's good to see you after many years. With COVID, everything feels, it's been ages. Yes, so now on Hong Kong, I mean, I think I'd like to think of Hong Kong in the same way that I think about Tibet and Xinjiang. So the capacity of the regime to penetrate compactly settled ethnic minorities is limited. And I think this would apply to Hong Kong, even though it's not an ethnic minority, but it's a jurisdiction that is partly under central control, but partly it is not. And when it comes to elections, there are surprises even in democracies. So in the case of Hong Kong, yes, obviously they were surprised, but I'd like to put Hong Kong in that category. Now, when it comes to the A4 revolution, I just recorded an interview with Kelly Tsai last week for the National Committee, and she asked me that question. And I think she expected a different answer from the one I gave her. So I think she expected me to say that this, of course, is evidence of surprise. I mean, they didn't expect that. And I think, well, certainly by the time that things started happening in Beijing, I mean, wouldn't they have sort of figured out that perhaps this was going to happen in Beijing? And then afterwards we talked and I said, Kelly, and this was not being recorded, I don't think I told you what you wanted to hear. And then we agreed that the bridge incident with the unfurling of the poster, I mean, that was a surprise. But perhaps, by the time we have the blank sheets of paper in Beijing, the leadership was anticipating that this might happen. The answer I gave was that zero COVID had to end. And that the way that these protests can be understood is as the government being responsive to popular demands. Whether this is true or not is a separate matter. I mean, it's one interpretation of what happened. But I mean, what she wanted me to say is, well, this, of course, was unanticipated. I don't know how unanticipated it was. Someday we might get the records that would allow us to know.
Professor Singh.
This is an incredible achievement. I have witnessed some of those 15 years, and I really can't wait to get my hands on it. So my question is really about the relationship between information and coercion. I was, I found it quite interesting to kind of reflecting the conversation with Tyler, this idea that, in the 50s and 60s, the information gathering is in a relatively nascent form, and then kind of, picks up. And so I was kind of curious about the variation in information gathering both temporally across time. So, between the 50s versus the 80s, 90s, and so forth. And now, versus, of course, the comparison between, Beijing and Eastern Europe and other places. And do you make the claim, or would you be comfortable making any claim at all for association rather between the strength of information gathering and then the kind of use of coercion?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Prerna. For this question, like others, Statis Kalivas, Sheena Greitens, and others, I do find that with better information, repression becomes selective. And then, of course, the question is, at what point and through what channels does the regime collect better information, and what are the blind spots in the information collection? So that's why in one of my China chapters, I have a case study of 59 in Tibet and the uprising. And I argue that the information collection capacity there was very limited. And that in Xinjiang, it was better, but then it declined. And this of course has implications. But the relationship between information quality and repression is clear to me. As the quality of information improves, so repression can become more selective, better targeted. So regimes don't have to repress as much. They don't have to repress entire groups of people. They can target the individuals that actually pose a threat to the regime. So for this reason, I think of the internment camps in Xinjiang as evidence of the poor information collection capacity of the regime in this ethnic region. To the last 5 years, like how it has changed today, that's a complicated question. Now, in terms of Eastern Europe, there was similar dynamics. So in the initial years after the establishment of the communist regimes, information collection the capacity was incomplete, which meant that there was heavy repression, and then over time, repression becomes more selective. The difference between Eastern Europe and China is that the transition towards selective repression happens faster in Eastern Europe because of bureaucratic endowment variations. And I have this index of state capacity where the census is quite important to my index, and an important article. So Professor Singh, for those who are not aware, has an important work on the census that I used in developing my index of communist state capacity.
So basically, would you then kind of say that so it seems to look like the nature of coercion, right? So it's more that like coercion kind of goes from being more blanket, intern everyone who you think might be a potential threat, versus kind of really targeted as the information capacity grows. And so I just want to because I think that's kind of interesting nuance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's more about like the nature of coercion, but I also wonder, is it then that you also, when your information capacity is low, are more likely to kind of target ethnic minorities because, they themselves you think are likely to be more of a threat period. And so, it's more just like who and what is being targeted. Your kind of enemies of the state or problematic populations kind of come in for more coercion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is super interesting. Ethnic minorities are initially ignored. So one of the benefits of low information collection capacity for ethnic minorities is that they're allowed to live without massive interference from the state. So if we look at the first years of Tibet, between 51 and 59, what Tibet had then is very similar to what Hong Kong had until a couple of years ago. It's actually striking parallels, because Tibet had its own currency in the 1950s. It also had diplomatic representation from foreign countries. There were two governments. There was a Tibetan government, and then there was a central government. And then there was, of course, the People's Liberation Army, but there was some military presence in Tibet as well. So that's in the 1950s. So they are enjoying some version of semi-autonomy, let's say. So, and this is in those initial years where the information collection is extremely patchy. But then there are more important enemies to the central government than ethnically concentrated minorities in the border areas. So those are dealt with later. In that initial period, of course, they're the leftovers of the KMT, they're secret societies. There's a range of enemies in China and in Eastern Europe. There are similar enemies. And then what we observe is haphazard repression against groups of people. And then, yes, indeed, as the capacity improves, with the non-minorities, repression becomes better targeted, but the minorities are a blind spot.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for your talk. I think it made me reflect a little bit on sort of this whole literature backsliding and democracies kind of. I think that's a thread that we'll perhaps we'll pick up later. But I have more specific questions about the very first slide and about the selection of the definition of information as being politically actionable intelligence, but would something like socioeconomic indicators, and especially more about economic consumption patterns, for example, which are super sensitive. And my questions are two parts to it. One is that to what extent does the regime then make this intelligence speak to that, other intelligence about who's consuming how much, what's hunger levels like in different parts? Because I think for me, there is a big conceptual problem if information doesn't include those data points. The other thing that I just want to flag up is to what extent is this then made into a more professional kind of training? Because I've been to the CCT, the Chinese information, what is very, very corporate, almost like a CNN building, and it's kind of beams the global television, and Genoa is also situated there. So it doesn't seem like it's run very secretively. It's very professionally done. What you're kind of, I think, at least in the recent years. So is there been a sort of professionalization, and then are they using tools of econometrics to measure these intelligence inputs and then model them? I mean, I'm just curious about their social scientific approaches to dealing with this action with intelligence.
Yes, well, thank you. These are great, provocative questions. So let me clarify in terms of the socioeconomic indicators. Of course, hunger levels is something that the regime is interested in. And the way that I think about that is this is a source of popular discontent. They track that. As to just actual levels of growth, so the reason why I didn't write about them is that I couldn't. I mean, information is this impossible concept where everything is about information, especially today. So I had to exclude certain things, and I decided I'm not going to write about the census because others have done it. And the census is not revealing anything about popular discontent. It's revealing all sorts of other things. And certain people get counted in various ways. It's fascinating, the politics of the census, but it's not for me. So it's in the introduction. Socioeconomic indicators, Jeremy Wallace has a book about statistical manipulation, as do various others. And I thought, I cannot possibly write about statistical manipulation and about tracking popular discontent and these other things. And what about the elites, which always comes up. So it was a question of deciding what was really essential to me and what is the actual hidden information. Because when it comes to socioeconomic indicators, indeed, this very professionalized statistics bureau is releasing more and more and more data, and then we can combine them with light emissions, and we can say, gosh, there's a difference between the two series. There must be lying somewhere. Well, maybe there is, or maybe there's just like GDP is this artificial concept. But I'll leave that to others that are more econometrically oriented, and this is, of course, of great interest to them. The kinds of indicators that I'm interested are not gathered by the statistics agency. So the Ministry of State Security is not open to observers. And in fact, you can't even get there. One can't. So the Ministry of Public Security publishes classified yearbooks. So these are not meant for public dissemination. Internal journalism is classified, so this does not publicly circulate. And Communist Party records are difficult and frequently impossible to obtain. So the kinds of materials that I'm interested in are materials generated for regime insiders. And this is not the Statistical Bureau. Which indeed is getting more and more professionalized. But the other entities, the other collectors are also getting better and better. So what we see with internal journalism today is that, the standard internal journalism was journalists actually did work. I mean, they went out, they talked to people. Now they monitor social media like everybody else. And they produce internal journalism on social media content. And, for years I've been getting questions. Well, what is the value of internal journalism today? I mean, it must have died off. There's social media, so the leaders can find all information by just getting on social media. And I thought, these leaders are very, very busy. So they don't have the time to scroll through endless social media like we all do all day long. I mean, they need somebody to distill the information for them and to transmit it, in predictable patterns. And indeed, the reports on social media content, the internal journalistic reports, is super interesting. What is trending? So 1 week, Kim Jong-un has disappeared from social media. So there's a lot of searching. Where is Kim Jong-un? And then he reappears. And then there's a lot of search on, he has reappeared, but he is different. And what happened? And this gets reported. And then they get reports on the most frequently circulating cartoons, not Winnie the Pooh. I mean, that's banned, but that was before the Winnie the Pooh. So there were other things. So yeah, they're quite interesting, these reports on social media.
I hear there's considerable variation in the amount of time that US presidents spend on social media.
And
Thanks. This is great, Martin. I can't wait to read the book. The conversation is so stimulating. I'm wrestling in my mind with, I think, two related issues. So one is trying to understand, in the Chinese case, variation over time regarding seeming tolerance in part of the state, the party state, to a degree of civic action, protest versus no tolerance at all. That on the one hand, and then I think related to that, the relationship between information, some kind of actionable data, and knowledge. Really knowing how to act on that, or understanding it in such a way that you can act effectively. So the first part, I'm thinking about, Jeremy Goldkorn's term, the naughty oddies that we all experienced in China, where there was a lot of stuff going on. I mean, you had journalists who were sort of in the system, but they were seeing some of them doing real journalism and pushing against the system, pushing the boundaries. And you had labor organizations, sort of, and NGOs encouraging it, and kind of partly within the state, but mostly not. And, it was somewhat repressed, but mostly tolerated. And women's groups and LGBTQ groups, again, stuff that was kind of seemingly transgressive, but not 100%, but tolerated. And it was, at least in my view, was pretty bold and kind of exhilarating, actually. And then today, of course, none of that. And whenever it's tried, it's just squashed. And my question is this: is it the case that the earlier period, the naughty oddies, well, the government has all the data and it's got the knowledge, it's framed it right, that this stuff is okay. The government's got like this brilliant sense of what's not too hot, not too cold, but just the right amount. And it tolerates the then versus, and today, it's got the same information, but it knows that its circumstances are different. It can't tolerate, so it exactly knows the thermostat. I don't imagine you're arguing that, because it's kind of a caricatured argument, versus the idea that there's all this information, and I don't know, depending on the nature of the leadership, the circumstances of the time, maybe vested interests of various kinds, they don't know what the hell. I mean, it's the other extreme, and they're just kind of extemporaneously or improvisationally trying to figure it out, probably poorly, and until some extreme happens. Now, and I realize I'm not really expressing this very clearly, but how do we, aside from ex post, just looking at what happens and justifying, so how do we make sense of this situation in which policy seems to towards the sorts of things we're talking about, social mobilization, protest policy, seems to vary quite a bit over time. The information seems more or less constant. The ability to get this information constant, but the action on that information seems to vary quite a bit. And I'll just say the difficulty in interpreting. We know the Pentagon papers that governments have a hard time, even when they have a lot of information, both interpreting it and acting upon it.
Yeah, Ed, thanks. That's
Sorry, it's a little all over the
no, it's a lot of questions. Now, great questions. So let me start with the last one, which is this issue of acting on the information that one has. There is, I don't think on that front there is a communist difference. So leaders in democracies may be unable to act even when they're informed, because making a decision is very complicated. They also make the wrong decisions. This happens. So has it become incredibly more difficult to act today when there's so much more information and the world is so much more complex? I think we'd like to think so, but one of the arguments in my book is that information transfer is always segmented. And we have this idea that the top leader needs to know about everything. And I actually think this is incorrect. Now, important things should not be obscured from the top leader. So the question is, what exactly should he know that he didn't know about? But the idea that they need to know about everything, that's impossible. So we don't quite know what Xi Jinping gets, but by the time it gets to him, it's been vetted. So these are the truly important matters that he needs to know about. So in any system, this is how things work, and decision makers get a subset of, or a tiny subset of the most important information that is collected. And then the question is, has the capacity of the leadership to act on that information become radically worse? And of course, COVID complicates everything. But if we were to put COVID aside, yeah, probably to some extent. So I don't know what we make of that. Now, the question about the 1990s and the aughts. Yeah, I mean, So there are a few things that happened then, which is the arrival of both new technologies and new business models. So what happened in the 1980s is that you do have media liberalization. And there is this sense that the private media in China, which is factually incorrect. There's no evidence of that, even for Caixin and Caixin. I mean, when one looks even there, they connect to the state. And all of these investigative journalistic outlets, they're either an organ of the propaganda department in Guangdong, or they're somehow related to some other state entity. But there was this change. So newspapers had to make money. So they had to publish content that people wanted to read rather than just leadership speeches. So they were publishing these interesting articles. But I've done this one piece where I note that the most widely known investigative reports appear without exception first in the internal media, and then they appear in the public media. So what do we make of that? The leaders didn't know about these matters from the public media. They knew about them from the internal media. So the question is, why did they allow this information to circulate in the public media? And there, I think it's for public relations purposes. They have to show that they're responsive to popular input. So when there's a story about corruption in investigative, and it looks like investigative journalism to us, the corrupt person is then punished. Or there's a story about some other scandal, and then the government does something. So when we trace the actual incidents from the emergence in the internal media to the publication of the so-called investigative report in the public media, and then to the government reaction, it allows us to construct a different story about why that appeared in those media outlets in the 90s and in the aughts. It's no longer there, right? So now the government demonstrates responsiveness in other ways. But that's the business model. The other thing, though, is the arrival of new technology. So when the internet arrived to China, it wasn't quite clear what one could do on the internet. So there were all sorts of things that were there before blocking, I mean, in that initial period, and then they weren't. And Twitter wasn't banned in China for a while, Facebook wasn't banned, YouTube wasn't banned. So these technologies were there, Gmail and so on and so forth. So they allowed for certain things, and then the government realized that they need to be controlled. Social media, I mean, like social media initially were not controlled, but then they were. So I think in part, when we think about these golden years, we do need to factor in the arrival of new technology and the experimentation with new business models. And this is a period when the government is calibrating a response without quite knowing what the potential of either the new business model in the media sector or the new technology is. But of course, one could also look at leadership and all of these things. So I don't quite know that we'll ever have correct answer, or perhaps there's not a single answer to your question. And it's something that's good to keep thinking about.
So we have time for one or two more questions. I'll collect them if there are any others besides you, sir. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Marty, for wonderful talk from the book as well. So my question is not from a political science perspective, but I'm curious, that has to do with how China would rally this public support for its response to climate change. So the reason I'm asking the question is to compare with the states here, also in this tax incentive, there's job, all this get into the public, try to get some support. China also is very different with this top-down policy on reaching the carbon zero and so on. So it's a very different approach. And also, it seems that China is also trying to expand its environmental policy to include climate change. So pollution is easy to get support because you can see it and solve the problem and get the support. But the climate issue is more not localized, more globalized. And so in your view, by looking your research on other aspect of public support, how China is doing or in the near future will do to rally the public support for its policy in response to climate change?
Thank you, first of all, for coming, and then also for the question. It's always good to get questions that come from outside one's field. I have not thought about this question. So to the extent that what I investigate in this book has relevance for climate change. What the government would want to know is how people feel about this issue. So they would certainly collect information on popular attitudes. And in terms of how they collect the information, they have a panoply of available options, including opinion polling that, for all my reservations about opinion polling, is getting better and better. And there's certain issues on which people will actually say how they feel. And climate change is probably one of those issues. So we don't have to be as concerned about preference falsification in that area. So the government would collect information, and then there would be an assessment about the mismatch between the popular sentiment and the government policy. And then in terms of changing popular sentiment, I mean, China has a prodigious capacity to engage in publicity work, as it's known, or propaganda, as some others might call it, or educating the masses, right? I mean, the means of public communication are controlled by the Communist Party, so it can get the message out. But of course, the message would have to be calibrated in the right way. And I think, I mean, if there's any relevance from what I do for climate change, they would have to collect the information first on how people feel, and then assess the mismatch, and then implement the right strategies. At least that's my wishful thinking based on what I have studied, which has nothing to do with climate change. But I should think about that as well. Thank you.
Well, again, please join me in thanking Professor Dimitrov for really a wonderful talk, a wonderful book, and look forward to more to come.
Thank you. Thank you all.